no one marked the date when it truly began. There was no announcement, no warning bell, no official notice pinned to a board somewhere on the mainland. But sometime in early winter, when Lake Superior darkened and thickened under a low sky, a simple fact quietly settled into place: one man was alone on the island, and the light depended on him. Out on the water, distance is deceptive. From shore, the lighthouse looked close enough to touch, a pale vertical line rising from rock and scrub. But between the mainland and that rock lay miles of cold, restless water, and once the season turned, those miles might as well have been a continent. Boats stopped coming. The wind sharpened. Ice began forming along the edges, thin at first, then stubborn, then dangerous. And when the last supply ship failed to arrive, the lighthouse keeper understood something without needing to say it out loud. Until spring, there would be no one else. The lighthouse had been built for moments like this, though no one ever said so directly. It was raised not for calm days or easy passages, but for the nights when the lake turned hostile, when visibility vanished and the margin for error narrowed to nothing. Its stone base was sunk deep into the island bedrock. Its walls were thick, practical, unadorned. Inside, everything had a purpose. The stairs curved upward tightly, worn smooth by decades of boots. The iron rail was cold to the touch, even indoors. At the top waited the lens, heavy and precise, designed to gather light and throw it miles across open water. The man responsible for it had learned early that this was not a place for improvisation. Routine mattered. Timing mattered. The light went on at the same moment every evening, regardless of weather, regardless of mood. It burned through fog, snow, and rain. Ships trusted it without knowing who maintained it, and the keeper understood that trust is something personal, even if it was never spoken. He had taken the job for reasons that would sound ordinary to anyone who had lived long enough to understand them. It was steady work. It was honest. It required attention and discipline, not chatter or ambition. The lake did not care about reputation. The lighthouse did not reward shortcuts. You showed up, you did the work, and you stayed. By December, the island had begun to feel smaller. Not physically smaller, but more complete, more sealed. The last patches of grass flattened under frost. Birds disappeared. The air carried a constant edge, sharp enough to wake him fully the moment he stepped outside. Each breath felt measured. Each movement felt deliberate. The lake no longer reflected the sky. It absorbed it, turning gray light into something heavier, darker. On clear days, he could still see the far shore, a thin line of trees and low hills, faded by distance. At night, there was nothing. No lights, no movement. Just the slow, relentless sound of water striking rock, over and over again, as if the lake were testing the island, reminding it of its insignificance. The keeper had been trained to listen. Not in a poetic sense, but in a practical one. Wind told him things. Ice told him things. Even the building itself spoke, through small shifts and sounds that revealed changes in temperature and pressure. He knew when a storm was coming long before the sky made it obvious. He knew when conditions were turning dangerous, even if the horizon still looked calm. That winter, the storms arrived early. The first one announced itself not with violence, but with stillness. The air grew unnaturally quiet. The lake flattened, its surface dark and tight, like stretched metal. He noticed it while checking the fuel levels, his hand resting on the cold steel drum, his breath visible in the dim interior light. The silence was wrong. It felt held back, restrained, as if something were gathering strength. By evening, the wind returned, stronger and more erratic. Snow came in sideways sheets, stinging exposed skin, rattling against the tower windows. Visibility dropped to nothing. The light cut through it in steady pulses, unchanged, unbothered. Inside, the keeper moved with the same calm precision he always used. Panic was useless here. There was no one to impress, no one to hear it. What few people understood about lighthouse work was how much of it happened before anything went wrong. The public imagined heroic moments, last-second rescues, dramatic signals in the dark. In reality, the job was about preventing those moments from ever occurring. It was about cleaning lenses long before they clouded. About checking mechanisms long before they seized. About noticing small irregularities and correcting them quietly. That night, as the storm intensified, he walked the spiral stairs again and again, checking, listening, adjusting. His boots rang softly on stone. His hands knew every latch and lever without hesitation. Outside, the lake roared. Inside, everything remained controlled. And yet, even in that control, something else crept in. It began as an awareness of time stretching. Hours felt longer. The gap between tasks widened. Without visitors, without conversation, the mind had fewer markers. Meals were eaten alone, in silence, standing at the small table near the stove. He tasted food less than he remembered it tasting before. Hunger arrived on schedule, but pleasure did not. He told himself this was normal. It always was at the start of winter. The body adjusted. The mind followed. There was comfort in repetition, even when it became dull. Especially when it became dull. Still, there were moments when he stood at the window longer than necessary, watching the snow erase the world, and wondered who, if anyone, was looking back. He did not expect an answer. The thought passed like all the others, carried off by routine. Some nights, ships appeared unexpectedly, their shapes emerging briefly from the storm before vanishing again. He never knew if they saw the light clearly, or if it was just one more reference point in a chaotic sea. He imagined the men aboard them, hands wrapped around cold rails, eyes narrowed against the dark. They trusted the light. They always had. The responsibility of that trust was heavy, but it was also simple. It required presence. Not brilliance. Not innovation. Just presence. As December deepened, the lake began to freeze in earnest. Sheets of ice formed and broke, collided and shifted, producing sharp cracks and distant booms that echoed through the night. The sound could be unsettling to newcomers. To him, it was just another signal. Ice meant isolation. Isolation meant the season had truly begun. The supply ship never came. By the time that fact became unavoidable, he had already adjusted his expectations. The fuel inventory was sufficient, if managed carefully. Food was basic but adequate. He had prepared for this possibility, as all keepers were taught to do, even if official schedules pretended otherwise. What no schedule accounted for was the way the world seemed to narrow once the option of departure disappeared entirely. Knowing you could leave and choosing not to was one thing. Knowing you could not leave at all was another. The lighthouse stood firm against the wind, its beam unwavering. Inside, the keeper continued his work, day after day, night after night. Each task completed fed into the next. Each evening ended as it always did, with the light ignited and the door secured against the cold. Somewhere beyond the storm, beyond the ice, life went on. Towns glowed. Roads stayed open. Men gathered in warm rooms and spoke of ordinary things. On the island, none of that existed. There was only the tower, the lake, and the understanding that for as long as winter held, the light and the man were inseparable. This was not a story of disaster. Not yet. It was the beginning of something quieter, something heavier. A season defined not by a single event, but by endurance. And as the wind howled around the stone walls and the beam swept endlessly across dark water, the lighthouse keeper settled into the truth he would live with for months to come. The world could forget him. The light could not. By the time the lake sealed itself with ice and the last distant sounds of movement faded from the horizon, the keeper's days settled into a rhythm so steady it almost seemed to erase the passage of time. Morning did not arrive with brightness. It arrived as a thinning of darkness, a subtle change in the quality of the air inside the tower. He would wake before the light outside changed, not because of an alarm, but because his body knew when it was time. The cold crept in first, touching his face, his hands, the back of his neck, reminding him that the stove would need tending. He moved slowly, deliberately, his boots finding the same spots on the floor each morning. The wooden planks were worn smooth where he walked most often, their grain raised slightly by decades of damp air and heat. When he placed his weight down, the boards answered with low, familiar creaks. Nothing sudden. Nothing sharp. Just the building acknowledging him. He struck a match, its brief flare lighting the small room with a soft orange glow, and coaxed the stove back to life. The smell of iron warming and old smoke filled the space, comforting in its predictability. Water had to be carried from the storage barrels, measured carefully. Every resource was accounted for, not with anxiety, but with respect. He washed his face in cold water that bit at the skin, fully waking him, then dried it with a towel that had been washed and rewoven countless times. Breakfast was plain and quiet. He chewed slowly, listening to the wind moving around the stone walls, feeling the steady heat from the stove spread outward, fighting the cold inch by inch. After eating, he climbed the spiral stairs, one hand on the iron rail, the other brushing the stone wall as he ascended. The steps were narrow, uneven from age, but he knew them so well he could have climbed them in darkness. At the top, the lens waited. It was massive, its glass surfaces catching what little light there was and bending it, shaping it. He cleaned it carefully, methodically, using cloths kept for that purpose alone. Each movement was practiced, unhurried. The lens did not forgive carelessness. Outside, the wind pressed against the glass panes, whispering and sometimes moaning, depending on its angle. Snow dusted the windows, clinging briefly before being swept away. The lake beyond was mostly hidden now, a field of white and gray, broken only by darker lines where ice shifted and cracked. He watched it while he worked, not searching for anything in particular, just letting his eyes rest on the distance. Once the checks were complete, he returned downstairs and recorded everything in the logbook. The act of writing was grounding. Pen on paper, numbers and short descriptions, each entry anchoring the day. Time here was not marked by conversation or appointments. It was marked by tasks completed, by checks made, by the reliable turning of routine. Midday passed almost unnoticed. Light outside never fully arrived, hovering instead in a dim, flat state that made it hard to tell 1 hour from the next. He repaired small things that needed attention, tightening screws, oiling hinges, smoothing rough edges with a worn file. The smell of oil mingled with the ever-present scent of stone and cold air. His hands worked steadily, fingers thickened and scarred from years of similar labor. They ached sometimes, a deep, dull ache that felt more like information than pain. When he stepped outside, he did so carefully, bundled against the wind. The air was sharp enough to sting the lungs, and each breath rose as a pale cloud before vanishing. Snow crunched underfoot, compacted by earlier storms into hard, uneven ridges. He moved slowly, scanning the area around the tower, checking for damage, for drifts that needed clearing, for anything out of place. The island was quiet in a way that felt complete, as if nothing else could exist beyond it. Sound behaved differently in winter. It carried farther, lingered longer. The wind had layers to it, low and high tones overlapping, sometimes rising into a hollow whistle around the tower's edges. Ice spoke in deep, echoing cracks that rolled across the lake like distant thunder. These sounds became part of the day, not distractions but companions, marking the hours as surely as any clock. He returned inside when the cold seeped through his layers, stamping snow from his boots and hanging his coat in the same place it always hung. The warmth inside felt heavier now, denser, wrapping around him as he shed the cold. He ate again, slowly, without hurry. There was nowhere to go, nothing waiting except the next task. Afternoons blurred into evenings. Shadows inside the tower lengthened, though they had never truly shortened. As the time approached to light the lamp, he climbed the stairs once more, feeling the familiar pull in his calves, the steady rhythm of breath and movement. At the top, he prepared the mechanism, checking fuel levels, ensuring everything was ready. When the moment came, he ignited the light with the same calm precision he always used. The beam sprang to life, steady and strong, cutting through the gathering darkness. It rotated smoothly, casting its long reach across ice and open water alike. He watched it for a moment, not with pride, but with satisfaction. The work was done correctly. That was enough. Night settled in fully then, a deep, encompassing presence. Inside the tower, the world contracted to lamplight and warmth, to the sound of wind and the distant groan of ice. He sat with a book sometimes, though he read slowly now, pages turning less for the story than for the act itself. Other nights, he simply sat, hands resting on his knees, listening. Fatigue came quietly. Not the sharp exhaustion of sudden effort, but a gradual heaviness, a soft pulling downward. His shoulders slumped slightly. His movements grew slower. When he stood, his joints protested briefly before settling. This tiredness felt earned, honest. It did not demand attention. It simply existed. Before sleeping, he made one last round, checking doors, adjusting the stove, ensuring everything was secure. The bed was narrow but sufficient, its blankets thick and worn smooth by use. He lay down fully clothed except for his boots, just as he always did, the fabric heavy and familiar against his skin. The mattress creaked softly as he shifted, then stilled. Sleep came in stages. At first, he was aware of every sound, every vibration through the stone. The wind, the ice, the faint mechanical hum from above. Slowly, these blended together, losing their edges. His breathing slowed. His thoughts thinned, drifting without shape or direction. Outside, the lighthouse beam continued its endless sweep, indifferent to whether anyone watched it or not. Inside, the keeper slept, his body surrendering to rest while his work carried on above him. Tomorrow would come without ceremony, just as today had passed. The routine would begin again, unchanged. And in that repetition, in that quiet constancy, the winter tightened its hold, day by day, night by night, while the man and the tower endured together, steady and unremarkable, doing exactly what they were built to do. By the middle of winter, fatigue no longer announced itself clearly. It did not arrive as a sudden weight or a sharp ache. It settled in the way cold does inside stone, quietly and completely, filling every space until it became part of the structure itself. The keeper noticed it first not in his body, but in time. Days began to lose their edges. Morning and evening felt closer together, as if the hours between them were thinning, stretching less and less with each passing cycle. He still woke before the change in light, but waking required more effort now. His eyes opened slowly, reluctant, as if the darkness inside the room held them shut. The stove had cooled more during the night, and the cold felt deeper, more persistent, pressing into his joints before he even moved. When he swung his legs over the side of the bed, the floor sent a familiar chill up through the soles of his feet, sharper than before, lingering longer. He dressed without thinking, hands moving through the same motions they always had, though his fingers felt thicker, less precise. Buttons resisted him slightly. Laces took longer to tie. These were small things, barely worth noticing, yet they accumulated, subtle signals that the season was wearing him down in ways he could not fully name. He breathed more carefully now, measuring each inhale against the cold air, letting it warm inside his chest before releasing it. The tower itself seemed heavier. Doors opened with a slower creak, as if the wood had stiffened. The spiral stairs demanded more attention. Each step felt higher, the curve more pronounced. His hand rested longer on the iron rail, drawing comfort from its solidity even as the metal leached warmth from his palm. He paused occasionally on the climb, not because he needed to, but because stopping felt natural, unremarkable, like the slowing of any machine run too long without rest. At the top, the lens waited as always, unchanged and indifferent. He cleaned it with the same care, though his movements lacked the crispness they once had. Cloth passed over glass in slow, circular motions, breath fogging the air briefly before dissipating. Outside the windows, the lake was a vast, unmoving plane of ice and shadow. The cracks and groans that had once caught his attention now blended into a single, low presence, a constant background hum that required no interpretation. The logbook entries grew shorter. Not out of negligence, but out of economy. There was less to say. Weather remained cold. Wind remained steady. The light remained functional. Writing too much felt unnecessary, almost wasteful, as if words themselves required energy better conserved. He still wrote clearly, deliberately, but the notes carried less detail, fewer observations. The essentials were enough. Meals became simpler. Hunger arrived more quietly, without urgency. He ate because it was time to eat, because the body required fuel, not because the act held any particular pleasure. The warmth from the stove was still welcome, but it did not spread as far as it once had. Cold lingered at the edges, in the corners of the room, in the backs of drawers and behind stacked supplies. The smell of smoke clung to everything, embedded in fabric and wood, so familiar it was barely noticed. When he stepped outside now, the effort felt greater. The wind cut through layers with practiced ease, finding gaps and seams, reminding him that no barrier was perfect. Snow no longer crunched sharply underfoot, it compressed with a dull resistance, shaped by repeated freezes and thaws. The island felt smaller than ever, its boundaries clearly defined, its every feature memorized. There was nowhere here that surprised him anymore. Sound, too, had changed. Or perhaps his attention to it had. The wind still moved around the tower, but he no longer tracked its shifts consciously. Ice still cracked and settled, but the sounds passed through him without registering fully, like distant traffic heard through walls. Silence came more often, and when it did, it felt thick, almost physical, pressing against his ears until even his own breathing seemed too loud. He spent more time sitting. Not resting, exactly, but pausing between tasks, letting moments stretch. His chair creaked beneath him, the wood molded to his shape from years of use. He rested his hands on his thighs and stared into the space between the stove and the wall, eyes unfocused. Thoughts drifted in and out without attachment. Memories surfaced briefly, then faded before they could take form. Faces appeared without names. Voices without words. Sleep grew heavier, but less refreshing. He dreamed more, though the dreams were indistinct, filled with movement rather than narrative. Water without waves. Light without source. He woke sometimes unsure how much time had passed, whether it was night or morning, until the cold or the stove or the faint mechanical sound from above reoriented him. Getting out of bed required a small negotiation now, a quiet argument between obligation and comfort that he always resolved the same way, though it took longer each time. The light remained steady. That was the anchor. No matter how the days blurred, no matter how his body slowed, the ritual of lighting the lamp each evening cut cleanly through everything else. It was the one moment that still felt sharp, defined. His hands moved with care born of long habit, checking, adjusting, igniting. When the beam came alive, sweeping outward into darkness, he felt a muted sense of completion, as if one essential thread had been successfully tied. Night brought its own kind of fatigue. Muscles softened. Shoulders sagged. He noticed aches that lingered rather than fading with movement. Sitting too long stiffened him. Standing too quickly sent a dull pulse through his knees and lower back. None of it was alarming. It was simply the body responding to months of cold, repetition, and solitude. Before bed, he lingered longer by the stove, letting its heat soak into him. The iron radiated warmth unevenly, hot near the surface, cooler a foot away. He turned his hands slowly, palms open, then backs, feeling the contrast, the slight sting as circulation returned. The smell of warm metal and ash filled the room, grounding him in the present moment. When he lay down, sleep came faster now, but it felt deeper, heavier, like sinking into cold water rather than drifting on its surface. Sounds blurred sooner. Sensations dulled. The wind outside continued its endless movement, but inside, his awareness narrowed, focused only on the steady rise and fall of his chest, the weight of blankets, the familiar pressure of the mattress. Days followed days without distinction. The calendar lost meaning. He crossed off dates out of habit, but the marks carried little significance. Whether it was Tuesday or Thursday mattered less than whether the light burned correctly, whether the stove held through the night, whether his body responded when called upon to move. This was the heart of winter, the long center where nothing changed quickly, where endurance replaced anticipation. The keeper did not think in terms of before or after. He existed in a continuous present, shaped by routine and necessity. Fatigue wrapped around him not as an enemy, but as a constant companion, slowing him, quieting him, easing sharp edges into something smoother. Outside, the lake slept beneath its cover of ice, vast and unmoving. Inside the tower, the man moved through his days with diminished effort, conserving what remained, trusting the structure, the habits, and the light to carry him through. And as the weeks passed in this muted state, winter pressed on, unyielding, patient, knowing that weariness, not force, was its most effective tool. Night became the dominant condition, not something that arrived and departed, but something that settled and remained, stretching itself thinly across the hours until even daylight felt like a variation of darkness rather than its opposite. The keeper no longer marked the transition consciously. He sensed it the way one senses pressure in the years before a storm, a quiet internal shift that required no attention. The tower existed in a permanent state of dimness now, lit by lamps and reflected firelight, its stone walls holding the cold at bay only partially, allowing it to breathe slowly inward. The final weeks of winter did not announce themselves with drama. There was no sudden collapse of routine, no failure of will. Instead, everything softened. Movements lost urgency. Sounds lost sharpness. Even thoughts seemed to arrive already tired, drifting rather than forming. When the keeper walked through the tower at night, his steps were quieter, not because he tried to be silent, but because his body no longer struck the floor with force. Boots met wood gently. The building responded in low murmurs. The light above continued its steady sweep, patient and unchanging. It had no awareness of seasons, no sense of duration. It simply turned, casting its beam outward, touching ice, touching darkness, touching nothing at all. The keeper trusted it completely now, trusted the mechanism to carry on without constant supervision. He still checked it, still followed procedure, but there was less tension in those moments. The light had proven itself, night after night, without complaint. Inside, the air held layers of familiar scent. Cold stone carried a mineral sharpness. Wood added a dry, dusty note. Smoke from the stove lingered faintly, woven into every fabric, every surface. These smells blended together until they became the smell of the tower itself, inseparable from the idea of shelter. Breathing them in felt grounding, as if each inhale confirmed his place in this enclosed world. He slept longer now. Not deeply, not always comfortably, but steadily. Sleep came like a tide, inevitable and slow. When he lay down, his body seemed to sink into rest before his thoughts could follow. Dreams were rare. More often there was simply a blankness, a gentle suspension where time loosened its grip. Waking was gradual. Awareness returned piece by piece, first the cold, then the weight of blankets, then the distant hum of the wind moving past stone. Sometimes he woke in the middle of the night, uncertain why. The tower was quiet, the stove glowing faintly, the light above continuing its rotation. He would lie still for a while, listening, counting breaths without numbers. Eventually, sleep reclaimed him without effort, pulling him back into that soft, unmarked space. The outside world felt increasingly abstract. He knew, intellectually, that towns existed, that roads were cleared, that people gathered in warm rooms and spoke to one another. But those ideas carried no emotional weight. They were facts without texture. The island, the tower, the routines, these were real. These had weight and temperature and sound. Everything else felt distant, flattened by imagination. On nights when the wind eased, silence pressed in from all sides. It filled the tower completely, leaving no gaps. Even the subtle sounds of settling stone and cooling metal seemed to retreat. In those moments, the keeper became acutely aware of his own presence, of the simple fact of breathing, of being awake in a place where nothing else moved. It was not frightening. It was complete. Fatigue had become a constant, but it no longer felt burdensome. It was a steady undercurrent, smoothing sharp edges, slowing impulses. His body operated at a reduced pace, conserving energy, responding only to what was necessary. There was a quiet efficiency in that, a sense that nothing was wasted. Each motion served a purpose, and when purpose was fulfilled, motion ceased. He found himself lingering longer at the window at night, not searching the darkness for ships, but watching the light itself as it passed through falling snow or thin mist. The beam appeared solid sometimes, a pale column reaching outward, then dissolving again. Watching it required no thought. It was something the eyes could follow while the mind rested. The tower creaked gently as temperatures shifted. Wood contracted, stone adjusted. These sounds were slow and deliberate, like the settling of an old ship at anchor. He listened without reacting, recognizing each sound as part of the structure's language. Nothing here was sudden. Nothing demanded alarm. Meals were eaten in near silence. The clink of utensils against metal echoed softly in the small room, then faded. Heat from the stove spread unevenly, warming his knees and hands while leaving his shoulders cool. He adjusted his position instinctively, seeking balance, letting comfort arrive in small increments rather than all at once. Evening routines blurred into one another. Lighting the lamp, checking levels, closing doors. Each action flowed into the next without conscious planning. Muscle memory guided him, freeing his attention to drift. Sometimes he caught himself standing still for a moment longer than necessary, hands resting at his sides, gaze unfocused. These pauses felt natural, like breaths taken between sentences. Outside, the lake remained frozen, its vast surface locked beneath ice that reflected faint starlight on clear nights. The stars themselves seemed distant and indifferent, cold points suspended above a world slowed nearly to stillness. He did not study them. He acknowledged their presence and turned back inside, where warmth and weight and shelter existed. As winter approached its quiet conclusion, there was no sense of anticipation. The idea of spring did not intrude. The keeper lived entirely within the present condition, within the gentle narrowing of days and nights into a single, extended moment. The light would continue. The stove would be fed. Sleep would come. That was sufficient. On one particularly calm night, the wind fell almost completely away. Snow drifted downward in slow, deliberate flakes, barely stirred by air. The tower stood motionless, its beam cutting through the stillness with unhurried regularity. Inside, the keeper lay awake briefly, listening to the absence of sound, feeling the weight of rest settle fully into his body. His breathing slowed. Muscles released what little tension remained. Thoughts thinned until they disappeared altogether. Sleep did not arrive as an event. It spread quietly, like warmth through cold hands, until there was no clear boundary between wakefulness and rest. Above him, the light turned. Outside, the lake slept. Inside the tower, time loosened its hold, allowing the night to stretch and deepen without resistance. The keeper slept on, carried by routine, by fatigue, by the steady, dependable presence of the world he had kept alive through winter. There was no ending here, no closing moment. Just continuity. Just the quiet persistence of stone and light and a man who had stayed, doing the work long after it ceased to feel remarkable, until even effort itself faded into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. No one came to stop him when he turned off the main road for the last time. There was no gate, no warning sign, no voice calling out that this was far enough. The path narrowed quietly, the ruts softened by pine needles and old leaves, and within minutes the sound of distant human activity fell away as completely as if it had never existed. From that point on, every step he took carried him deeper into a world that did not ask questions and did not offer second chances. The cabin waited where it had always been, half hidden by trees, its rough outline blending into the forest as if it had grown there rather than been built. It was small, deliberate, shaped by need rather than comfort. Squared logs darkened by age formed its walls, their surfaces cracked and uneven beneath his hand. The roof sloped low, heavy with old repairs, each layer added during a season when survival had mattered more than appearance. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney. Not yet. The place had been empty for weeks, waiting. He stood there for a moment before opening the door, listening. The forest spoke in its own restrained language. Wind passed through branches high above, producing a low, steady sigh. Somewhere deeper in the trees, something shifted, an animal, perhaps, moving without urgency. Nothing acknowledged him directly. Nothing needed to. He had chosen this place deliberately. In the years before, he had lived among others, close enough to hear their voices through walls, close enough to know their habits. He had worked when work was available, moved when circumstances demanded it, and learned early that stability was never promised. The forest offered something different. It offered permanence of a kind, not through comfort, but through indifference. Trees did not care why you came. They did not ask how long you planned to stay. They simply remained. The door opened with a long, dry creak that echoed briefly inside the cabin before settling into silence. Cold air greeted him immediately, sharp and stale, carrying the scent of old wood and dust. Light filtered in through a single small window, illuminating suspended motes that drifted slowly, unhurried. The interior was exactly as he remembered it. A simple table. A narrow bed. Shelves lined with tools and supplies gathered over years. Nothing extra. Nothing wasted. He set his pack down carefully, as if noise might matter here, and began the quiet process of returning life to the space. The stove came first. He checked it with practiced hands, running fingers along seams and hinges, making sure nothing had shifted during his absence. Firewood lay stacked neatly against the wall, split and dried long ago in preparation for this season. He carried a few pieces over, feeling their weight, their rough bark against his palms. When the first flame caught, it did so reluctantly, then steadily, licking upward and casting a warmer light across the room. The smell of smoke spread slowly, replacing the cold, unused scent with something older, more familiar. The cabin began to change almost immediately, wood expanding slightly as it warmed, the air softening, the space becoming habitable again. Outside, the day moved on without him. The sun dipped lower, its light thinning as it filtered through bare branches. Autumn had already taken its hold, stripping the forest down to essentials. Leaves lay thick on the ground, damp and dark, muting sound underfoot. Winter was not far. He knew this. He had planned for it. The last visitor had come weeks earlier, a man from a nearby settlement who had helped transport supplies as far as the forest edge. They had spoken briefly, mostly about practical things. Weather. Distance. Time. At the end, there had been a pause, the kind that suggests something more might be said. But nothing was. The visitor had turned back, his footsteps fading quickly, swallowed by trees. That moment had mattered more than he expected. As evening settled, the forest grew quieter. Birds stilled. Wind eased. Shadows stretched between trunks, long and narrow. Inside the cabin, he unpacked methodically, placing each item where it belonged. Tools returned to their hooks. Food stores were checked, counted without anxiety. Everything necessary was present. Enough, if managed carefully. He stepped outside once more before full dark, breathing deeply. The air was clean and cold, carrying the faint resinous scent of pine. Somewhere far off, a branch cracked, sharp and brief. The sound traveled, then vanished. He scanned the tree line out of habit, not fear, noting nothing unusual. The forest did not announce its dangers loudly. It revealed them slowly, if at all. When he returned inside and closed the door, the cabin felt sealed, separated. The fire crackled softly, its sound filling the space with a steady rhythm. Light flickered against the walls, bringing out the texture of the logs, the marks left by tools and time. He sat at the table, hands resting flat on the wood, feeling its grain beneath his palms. This was not an escape. He did not think of it that way. Escapes implied running from something, a sense of urgency or fear. This was closer to an acceptance. A decision to live within limits that were clear and unchanging. The forest did not promise ease, but it offered honesty. Every mistake would be immediate. Every success would be earned. Night arrived without ceremony. Darkness pressed in from all sides, complete and unbroken by artificial light. The cabin existed now as a small island of warmth and glow within a vast, indifferent sea. He lit a lamp and set it carefully on the table, its flame steady, its light soft. Shadows deepened at the edges of the room, leaving the center clear. He ate slowly, the simple meal tasting of smoke and salt. Each bite was deliberate. There was no rush. Outside, something moved through the undergrowth, a brief rustle followed by silence. He did not react. Sounds like that were part of the forest's constant conversation. As the night deepened, he considered the months ahead, though not in detail. He knew what winter meant here. He had lived it before. Snow would come, first lightly, then in heavy, relentless falls. Paths would disappear. The world would shrink to the distance he could walk in a day, then less. Isolation would become complete. The thought did not trouble him. He prepared the bed, laying out thick blankets, smoothing them with care. The mattress was firm, unforgiving, but familiar. He removed his boots and set them by the door, close enough to reach in the dark. The cabin was quiet now except for the fire and the occasional sigh of settling wood. Before lying down, he stood for a moment, listening. The forest at night had a depth to it that daytime concealed. Sounds traveled differently. Silence was never truly silent, but layered, full of distant movement and unseen presence. He felt himself becoming part of that pattern, another quiet thing among many. When he finally lay down, the weight of the day settled into him. Fatigue came not as exhaustion, but as a gentle pull, guiding him toward rest. The fire continued to burn steadily. Outside, the trees stood motionless, patient. This was the beginning of a season spent at the edge of the world, where time moved according to weather and light, and a man lived by his own hands, alone with the forest, knowing that once winter truly arrived, there would be no turning back. The days that followed settled into a pattern so gradual it was almost invisible, like the slow tightening of cold around the edges of the forest. Morning revealed itself not with sunlight, but with a slight change in the color of the air inside the cabin. Darkness thinned into a dull gray, just enough to show the outlines of the walls and the steady shape of the stove. He woke without urgency, his body rising from sleep the way embers glow back to life when stirred, quietly and without effort. The first task was always the fire. He knelt beside the stove, feeling the chill seep through the knees of his trousers, and opened the iron door. Inside, Yesterday's warmth had reduced itself to ash and faint red traces hidden beneath it. He stirred them gently, added split wood chosen for its dryness, then struck a match. The brief flare illuminated his hands, rough and steady, before settling into a low, reliable flame. As the stove warmed, the cabin responded. Wood expanded slightly, releasing soft creaks. The air shifted, carrying the familiar smell of smoke and resin. Water came next. He stepped outside with a bucket, breath clouding in front of him, boots sinking slightly into damp leaves. The forest floor was dark and yielding, its surface shaped by countless seasons of decay and renewal. He moved carefully, knowing exactly where to place his feet, following paths he had walked so often they existed more in memory than in sight. The water source lay a short distance away, sheltered by rock and roots. He filled the bucket slowly, listening to the quiet movement of water beneath its surface, then carried it back, arm muscles tightening under the steady weight. Breakfast was simple and repetitive, taken standing by the table while the fire grew stronger. He ate slowly, chewing thoroughly, feeling warmth spread through his chest and down into his limbs. There was no hurry to finish, no schedule pressing in from outside. Time here was shaped entirely by need. When hunger faded, he cleaned his utensils, dried them carefully, and returned them to their place. Once fed and warm, he turned to the work that filled most of his daylight hours. Tools came off their hooks one by one, each carrying its own weight and history. Metal felt cold at first touch, then gradually accepted the warmth of his hands. He checked traps set along the forest edge, moving quietly through trees that stood bare and patient. The sound of his movement was muted by leaves and soil, his presence absorbed rather than announced. When he reset a trap or adjusted its position, he did so with care, aware that precision mattered more than speed. The forest revealed itself slowly as the season advanced. Light filtered through branches at low angles, catching on rough bark and patches of moss. The air smelled of earth and old growth, layered with the faint sharpness of approaching cold. He paused often, not to rest, but to observe. The forest communicated through subtle signs. A broken twig. A disturbed patch of leaves. Tracks pressed lightly into soft ground. These details required attention, and attention filled the hours without effort. Back at the cabin, he worked on repairs that had waited through summer. A loose board on the roof. A door hinge that complained when moved. He climbed carefully, tools hanging from his belt, feeling the cabin beneath him as a solid, reliable presence. Wood under his hands felt dry and fibrous, worn smooth where it had been handled repeatedly. Each adjustment, each tightened nail, brought a quiet sense of order, of preparation completed. Midday arrived almost unnoticed. Light outside shifted from gray to a pale, washed-out white, then began its slow decline. He ate again, another simple meal, then sat briefly on the edge of the bed, boots still on, elbows resting on his knees. The fire crackled steadily. Outside, the forest held its breath, waiting. Afternoons were often spent cutting wood. He chose trees carefully, selecting those already weakened, their bark loose, their branches sparse. The sound of the axe echoed dully through the trees, a rhythmic impact that felt both foreign and fitting in the quiet. Each swing was measured, guided by experience rather than force. Sweat gathered under his collar despite the cold, cooling quickly when he paused. The smell of fresh-cut wood rose sharply, clean and alive, contrasting with the older, deeper scents around it. He stacked the split logs neatly near the cabin, building a supply that would carry him through months when venturing far would be difficult. His shoulders ached pleasantly by the time he finished, a deep fatigue that felt honest and earned. He stood for a moment, breathing steadily, watching his breath dissolve into the air, then carried the last of the wood inside. As evening approached, the forest darkened quickly. Shadows thickened between trunks, merging into a single, continuous dusk. He closed the cabin door firmly, securing it against wind and cold, and lit the lamp. Its glow filled the small space with soft light, leaving corners in shadow. The world beyond the window faded into blackness. Dinner followed the same unspoken rules as every other meal. Slow, quiet, uncomplicated. He listened to the sounds of the forest outside, now reduced to occasional movements and distant calls. The fire provided a steady backdrop, its warmth constant, its sound soothing. When he finished eating, he cleaned again, maintaining the order that made life here manageable. Evening stretched gently. Sometimes he mended clothing, needle passing through thick fabric with a soft resistance. Sometimes he sharpened tools, the whetstone whispering as metal slid across its surface. These tasks required just enough attention to occupy the mind without exhausting it. His body began to relax, muscles releasing tension accumulated through the day. Fatigue arrived gradually, not demanding rest but inviting it. His eyelids grew heavier. Movements slowed. He added wood to the stove one last time, adjusting the airflow carefully so it would burn through the night. The smell of smoke deepened briefly, then settled. Before sleeping, he stepped outside once more. The night air was colder now, sharper, filling his lungs with clarity. Stars appeared faintly through the branches, distant and steady. He stood there, listening to the forest at rest, feeling himself reduced to something simple and present, a man standing alone between trees and sky. When he returned inside and lay down, the cabin felt smaller, more enclosed, its walls close and protective. Blankets weighed comfortably on his body. The fire's glow flickered faintly, casting slow-moving shadows. His breathing evened out. Thoughts drifted without form, then thinned until they disappeared altogether. This routine repeated itself day after day, each cycle reinforcing the next. Work, food, fire, rest. The cabin grew warmer, more lived in. The forest shifted subtly, leaves falling, air cooling, light fading. Winter edged closer with quiet persistence, and the man at the edge of the world met it with steady hands and a mind shaped by repetition, settling deeper into the rhythm of a life lived one deliberate day at a time. The first true storm of the season arrived without ceremony, not announced by thunder or wind, but by a change in the way the air pressed against the cabin walls. He sensed it before he saw it, a heaviness settling over the forest, damp and patient, as if the sky itself had decided to rest its weight upon the trees. Rain began sometime in the early afternoon, at first a thin, almost polite tapping on the roof, then slowly deepening into a steady, enveloping sound that erased distance and softened every edge of the world. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low and constant, its heat spreading evenly through the space. The scent of wet earth drifted in through the smallest gaps around the door and window frames, mixing with smoke and old wood. He moved more slowly now, not because he needed to, but because the day invited it. Rain changed the pace of everything. It pressed time flat, stretching moments into long, continuous spans where nothing needed to be rushed. He sat at the table with a mug cupped in both hands, feeling the warmth soak into his palms. Outside, water slid down the window in thin, wavering lines, distorting the forest beyond into dark vertical shapes. The sound of rain on the roof was layered and complex, individual drops disappearing into a collective hush that filled the air completely. It was a sound that required no interpretation, no response, only listening. When the mug was empty, he stood and added another log to the stove. The door opened with a familiar resistance, metal warm to the touch, and the fire responded with a brief flare before settling back into its slow burn. He closed the door carefully, adjusting the damper by instinct, then stood still for a moment, listening as the stove resumed its steady breathing. Rain meant indoor work, or no work at all. He chose the latter for a while, sitting back in his chair, boots stretched out in front of him, eyes half closed. Fatigue rested in his body like a deep, comfortable weight. Not the sharp exhaustion of overwork, but the kind that came from days lived evenly, muscles used and then allowed to rest. His shoulders loosened. His breathing slowed. As the light outside dimmed further, he rose and lit the lamp. Its glow pushed back the encroaching darkness, reflecting softly off the wooden walls. Shadows moved lazily with the flame, never sudden, never sharp. He picked up a piece of wood he had been shaping for some time, running his thumb along its surface, feeling the grain beneath the skin. The wood was smooth now, shaped by hours of quiet attention. He set to work again, carving slowly, each movement deliberate and unhurried. The rain intensified as evening approached, the sound deepening, becoming more insistent without ever becoming harsh. It drummed on the roof, soaked into the ground, ran in unseen streams between roots and stones. He could imagine the forest floor darkening, leaves pressed flat, the soil drinking deeply. That image required no effort. It rose naturally, as familiar as memory. When hunger made itself known, he prepared dinner without thought, hands moving through familiar motions. The warmth of the stove, the soft light, the constant rain combined into a single, enclosing presence. He ate slowly, tasting each bite, pausing often, listening. There was no silence here, only the rain, steady and endless, and beneath it, the faint ticking of the stove as metal expanded and contracted. Night arrived fully while the rain continued, uninterrupted. Darkness pressed against the windows, but it felt distant, held back by the walls and the light. After eating, he cleaned, dried his hands on a worn cloth, then returned to his chair. He sharpened a knife, the whetstone producing a low, rhythmic whisper that blended with the rain. His hands knew the angle, the pressure. He did not need to look. Time passed unnoticed. The storm showed no sign of moving on, and he felt no need for it to do so. Eventually, fatigue deepened into something heavier, pulling gently at his eyelids. He prepared the stove for the night, adding wood, setting it to burn slow and steady. The cabin felt warmer now, more enclosed, as if the storm outside had tightened its boundaries. He lay down fully clothed, blankets pulled up to his chest. The mattress yielded beneath his weight, familiar and forgiving. The rain on the roof became more pronounced from this position, each drop sounding closer, more immediate, yet still soothing. His breathing matched the rhythm unconsciously, slow and even. Sleep came in layers. First, his muscles released their last tension. Then thoughts drifted, becoming indistinct. The sound of rain filled the space where thought might have been, leaving nothing sharp or demanding. He slept deeply, undisturbed by the storm, held by the warmth and the constant sound. When he woke, it was still raining. Light filtered weakly through the window, gray and diffuse. The fire had burned down to coals, but the cabin retained its warmth. He lay still for a while, listening, letting his body wake at its own pace. The smell of damp wood and smoke lingered, comforting and familiar. The day unfolded much like the one before. Rain ruled the hours, limiting movement, encouraging stillness. He tended the fire, prepared food, sat and watched the window. Occasionally, the rain would soften, only to return moments later with renewed persistence. There was no impatience in him, no urge to push against it. The storm dictated the rhythm, and he accepted it. By the second evening, the rain began to change. It grew colder, sharper. Somewhere during the night, the sound shifted subtly, becoming quieter, more muffled. When he woke, the world outside was transformed. Snow lay on the ground in a thin, unbroken layer, clinging to branches and stones alike. The forest looked smaller, closer, its edges softened by white. He stood at the window for a long moment, taking it in. Snow altered sound even more completely than rain. The world felt hushed, wrapped, as if padded. He felt the change in his body too, a deepening of stillness, a narrowing of focus. Winter had arrived in earnest. Outside work was minimal now. He ventured out only when necessary, movements careful, deliberate. Snow creaked softly underfoot, a sound both crisp and gentle. The air was cold and clean, filling his lungs with sharp clarity. Each breath felt deliberate, measured. Inside, the cabin became the center of everything. The fire burned more often, the stove rarely allowed to cool completely. He fed it regularly, tending it with the same care one might give a living thing. The cabin responded, staying warm, its walls holding heat, its presence steady. Days shortened. Light outside faded quickly, mornings arriving late, evenings early. He adjusted without thought. Meals shifted slightly. Sleep came earlier. Fatigue deepened, but remained gentle. His body adapted to the cold, conserving energy, moving only when needed. Evenings stretched longer now. He sat often by the fire, watching flames move lazily around the wood, listening to the subtle sounds of burning. The smell of smoke was richer in the cold air, grounding, familiar. Sometimes snow tapped softly against the window, a faint, irregular sound. In these long hours, memory surfaced quietly. Not sharply, not insistently, but like distant shapes moving beneath still water. Past winters. Other places. Other fires. He did not follow these thoughts far. He let them drift, acknowledging them without attachment, allowing them to pass. The cabin, the forest, the snow, the fire all blended into a single, continuous experience. There were no clear divisions between day and night, work and rest. Everything flowed together, slow and unbroken. He lived inside that flow, carried by it, his presence steady and unremarkable, a man existing quietly within the long, patient unfolding of winter. By the time winter settled fully into the valley, it no longer felt like a season so much as a state of being, a slow and steady presence that shaped every sound, every movement, every breath. Snow lay deep now, layered and compacted, its surface marked only by the occasional track of a passing animal or the careful impressions of his own boots when he stepped outside. Most days, though, he remained indoors, the cabin holding him like a quiet center while the world beyond rested under its pale covering. The fire became the heart of everything. Its heat was constant, radiating outward, seeping into the wood of the walls, the floor, the furniture, until the entire space seemed to breathe warmth. The sound of it was low and reassuring, a soft shifting and settling punctuated by the gentle crack of burning wood. Smoke carried a familiar scent, rich and dry, clinging lightly to his clothes and hair, reminding him with each breath that he was sheltered, that the cold remained outside. Mornings came slowly. Light filtered through the small window in muted tones, reflecting off snow and filling the cabin with a soft, even glow. He woke without alarm, his body guiding him out of sleep when it was ready. The blankets were warm, heavy enough to hold him in place for a few moments longer, encouraging stillness. He listened before moving, taking in the quiet, so complete it felt almost tangible. When he finally rose, the cold made itself known only briefly, a faint chill against his skin before the warmth of the fire reclaimed him. He moved deliberately, conserving energy, each action unhurried. The kettle went on the stove. Wood was added to the fire. The day began without announcement, unfolding naturally from the night. Outside, the forest stood motionless, branches bowed under the weight of snow. Sound traveled differently now, muted and softened. Even when the wind moved through the trees, it did so gently, producing a low, distant whisper rather than a rush. Sometimes snow fell again, not in storms, but in slow, steady drifts, flakes descending silently, barely noticeable until they accumulated. He spent long hours seated near the fire, hands resting loosely in his lap or wrapped around a warm mug. Fatigue was a constant companion, but not an unwelcome one. It sat deep in his muscles, a reminder of days lived fully and simply. His breathing slowed to match the rhythm of the space, steady and even, rising and falling without effort. Occasionally, he worked with his hands, small tasks that required attention but not urgency. Repairing a tool, sanding a piece of wood, stitching a tear in fabric. The texture of materials grounded him, the roughness of wood grain beneath his fingers, the smooth resistance of metal, the softness of worn cloth. These sensations filled the hours quietly, marking time without demanding it. Meals were simple, warming. He ate slowly, savoring the heat, the solidity. The act of eating felt purposeful, necessary, but never rushed. Afterward, he would sit back, letting warmth spread through his body, eyelids growing heavy as the fire continued its low song. Evening stretched long. Darkness arrived early, pressing against the windows, but the cabin remained bright enough, its interior defined by lamplight and flame. Shadows moved gently along the walls, never sharp, never startling. He welcomed the night, its depth, its quiet. Sleep came more easily now, arriving not as an end but as a continuation of the same slow rhythm. Dreams, when they came, were indistinct, shaped more by sensation than image. Warmth. Stillness. The distant sound of wind. He woke from them without jolt, slipping back into awareness gradually, the line between sleep and waking blurred and gentle. Days passed like this, blending together, each much like the last, yet never dull. There was comfort in repetition, in knowing what the next hour would bring. The world had narrowed, but in that narrowing, it had deepened. Each small thing carried weight and presence. The sound of a log settling in the fire. The faint creak of the cabin as it adjusted to temperature changes. The soft brush of snow against the window. As winter reached its deepest point, the cold outside intensified. The air carried a sharper edge when he stepped beyond the door, biting briefly at exposed skin. He moved carefully, aware of his footing, of the way snow concealed uneven ground. Each excursion was brief, purposeful. He returned inside with relief, shedding cold at the threshold. Inside, warmth reclaimed him quickly. He would stand near the fire for a moment, hands extended, feeling heat sink back into his fingers. That simple sensation never lost its power. It reminded him of contrast, of shelter earned and maintained. At night, the wind sometimes rose, pushing against the cabin, sending low moans through the trees. Snow rattled softly against the walls, a faint percussion. He lay in bed listening, feeling the cabin hold firm around him. There was no fear in these sounds, only acknowledgement. Winter announced itself, and he listened, accepting its presence. Eventually, almost without notice, the quality of light began to change. Mornings arrived a little earlier. The gray softened, carrying hints of brightness. Snow still covered the ground, but it glistened differently, responding to the sun with a subtle shimmer. He noticed these shifts without analyzing them, feeling them more than seeing them. The fire burned just as steadily. The routine remained unchanged. Yet beneath it, something eased. The cold, though still present, no longer felt absolute. There were moments when the air outside felt lighter, less severe. The forest seemed to breathe again, imperceptibly. One afternoon, he stood at the door longer than usual, looking out. The snow was still deep, but there was a sense of waiting in the air, a quiet anticipation. He closed the door gently and returned to his chair, the warmth wrapping around him once more. Fatigue remained, but it had shifted. It was no longer the heavy pull of winter's deepest days, but a softer, more flexible weariness. His body still welcomed rest, but it also felt ready, awake beneath the surface. He spent the evening as he had countless others, firelight flickering, shadows moving lazily. The smell of smoke lingered, comforting. Outside, the forest held its silence. He breathed slowly, deeply, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest. When he lay down to sleep that night, it came easily, smoothly. The blankets were warm. The mattress familiar. The sounds of the cabin settled around him like a protective shell. His thoughts drifted without form, without urgency. In sleep, time loosened its hold. Hours passed unnoticed. When he woke again, it was to a different quality of quiet. Not the deep hush of snowfall, but something lighter. He rose and looked out the window. The sky was pale, clear. Snow still covered the ground, but the air held a new clarity. Light moved freely now, unfiltered by cloud or falling flakes. The forest stood revealed, dark shapes against white, calm and patient. He stood there for a long moment, neither smiling nor frowning, simply taking it in. There was no sense of ending, no sharp transition. Winter had not departed, but it had relaxed its grip. He turned back to the cabin, to the fire, to the warmth. The day awaited, unremarkable and complete. He moved through it as he always did, slowly, deliberately, fully present. The rhythm he had lived within for so long continued, steady and grounding. As evening came once more, light fading gently rather than abruptly, he sat by the fire, listening to its quiet voice. Outside, the forest remained still, holding its breath between seasons. Inside, warmth and stillness reigned. His eyes grew heavy. Fatigue settled in again, familiar and welcome. He let it take him, surrendering to rest without resistance. The fire burned on, the cabin held firm, and the world beyond waited patiently. In that space between waking and sleep, where sensation softened and time stretched thin, everything felt exactly as it should. The slow pulse of warmth. The faint scent of smoke. The deep, steady quiet. Nothing needed to be done. Nothing needed to change. He rested there, suspended in the gentle continuity of it all, as sleep closed in, complete and unbroken. I'll answer as a world-famous historical storyteller specializing in North American frontier isolation narratives, recipient of the Bancroft Prize for American History. What if the loneliest job in America wasn't at sea, or buried in snow, but under an endless sky where nothing moved for days, and the silence itself could drive a man to doubt his own thoughts? In the early years of the 20th century, before highways cut lines through the desert and before radio voices filled the air, there were men sent into places so empty they barely felt real. One of them walked alone across a sun-bleached basin in the spring of 1907, carrying instruments most people had never seen, tasked with measuring land no one intended to live on. His name barely survives in records, but the choices he made out there still raise quiet questions, because the desert does not forgive mistakes, and it does not explain itself. The map said the region was simple. A broad stretch of high desert in the American Southwest, broken by low ridges and dry washes, marked by distances that looked manageable when reduced to ink and paper. On the ground, it was something else entirely. The horizon never seemed to get closer, no matter how long he walked. The air shimmered even in the early morning, heat already rising from the pale earth. His boots left clear impressions in the dust, each step precise, measured, and intentional, because wandering even a few degrees off course could mean missing the next water cache entirely. He was a government surveyor, trained and methodical, sent to chart land for future rail lines that might never come. His tools were heavy and exacting, a transit wrapped in oiled cloth, steel chains for measuring distance, notebooks thick with blank pages waiting to be filled with numbers and notes. Each item had a purpose, each had been checked twice before he left the last rail stop behind. Out here, there would be no replacements, no second chances. If something broke, he fixed it. If he made an error, he lived with it. The desert greeted him without ceremony. No birdsong, no rustle of leaves, only the faint crunch of gravel underfoot and the slow rhythm of his breathing. The land rolled gently, deceptive in its softness. Low shrubs clung to life where they could, their shadows short and sharp in the growing light. Far off, mountains hovered like mirages, blue and distant, offering no sense of scale. He had studied deserts before, but knowledge and experience were different things, and the first hours alone confirmed that truth. By mid-morning, the sun was already asserting its authority. The heat pressed down steadily, not violently, but with persistence that wore on the body and mind alike. Sweat evaporated almost as quickly as it formed, leaving behind a crust of salt on his skin. He drank sparingly, knowing every swallow needed to last. Water was measured more carefully than distance, its weight felt keenly in his pack with each step. There was a strange clarity to the work. He stopped at designated points, planted his tripod, and sighted across the land, aligning angles with practiced calm. Numbers filled the pages of his notebook, precise and unemotional. In those moments, the desert receded slightly, becoming a backdrop rather than an adversary. The act of measuring imposed a kind of order, a human grid laid gently over a place that did not acknowledge it. Still, the isolation crept in. Hours passed without any change in the landscape. No sign of another person. No sound beyond wind brushing lightly over the ground. The silence was not empty, it was full, dense, pressing in from all sides. It invited thought, and then too much of it. He caught himself listening for noises that weren't there, scanning the horizon without reason, aware that the mind, left alone too long, begins to invent company. He remembered the men who had warned him before he left. Not about heat or thirst, but about time. About how days stretched and bent in places like this, how a man could work steadily and still feel as though he were standing still. They had spoken quietly, respectfully, as men do when discussing something they had endured and did not wish to dramatize. At the time, he had nodded, confident in his training. Now, with the sun climbing higher, he understood a little more of what they meant. Around noon, he took shelter in the narrow shadow cast by his equipment. It wasn't much, but it broke the direct line of the sun, enough to rest his eyes and slow his breathing. He ate sparingly, dry food chewed carefully, each bite deliberate. The taste was unremarkable, but the act of eating grounded him, reminded him of routine and normalcy. He checked his notes again, confirming figures he already knew were correct. Accuracy was comfort. As the afternoon wore on, the heat deepened. The land seemed to hum faintly, a low vibration felt more than heard. Distance played tricks on the eye. A rock formation that looked an hour away took half the day to reach. He adjusted his pace, conserving energy, trusting his calculations more than his instincts. The desert rewarded patience, punished haste. Late in the day, He reached a planned stopping point near a shallow depression where rainwater sometimes collected. It was dry now, cracked earth bearing witness to storms long past. Still, this was where he would camp. He set his pack down carefully, movement slowing as fatigue made itself known. The weight he had carried all day seemed to settle into his shoulders all at once. As evening approached, the light shifted. Harsh brightness softened into warm tones, shadows lengthening across the ground. The desert changed character without changing shape, becoming quieter still, if that was possible. The heat eased slightly, releasing its grip just enough to allow the body to relax. He took a small amount of water, savoring the coolness, feeling it move through him. He built no fire. There was nothing to burn, and no need. Instead, he sat and watched the sun descend, the sky opening into layers of color that seemed almost excessive after the day's restraint. When the sun finally slipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped with surprising speed. He pulled on a jacket, fabric stiff from dust, and settled back against his pack. Night arrived fully, bringing stars in numbers he had rarely seen. They filled the sky completely, sharp and unwavering. Without moonlight, the land disappeared, leaving him suspended in darkness and open space. It was beautiful, but also humbling, a reminder of scale that no map could convey. He lay back and stared upward, listening to his own breathing, steady but tired. The day replayed itself in fragments, measurements taken, distances crossed, moments of doubt dismissed. Tomorrow would be much the same. More lines to draw across an indifferent landscape. More numbers to write down, anchoring his presence in a place that would never remember him. Before sleep claimed him, a thought surfaced, uninvited but persistent. Somewhere beyond the horizon, men sat in offices, warm and occupied, waiting for these figures, these neat rows of data. They would never see the ground as he had seen it, never feel the weight of silence or the slow burn of the sun. Yet their decisions would reshape this land, all based on what he recorded out here alone. The desert did not respond to such thoughts. It remained as it was, vast and unmoved. He closed his eyes, letting the fatigue pull him under, knowing that when morning came, the land would look the same, and the work would continue. The mystery was not whether he could finish the task, but what the desert might quietly take from him along the way, piece by piece, without him ever noticing until he returned to a world that felt strangely smaller than before. Morning in the desert did not announce itself with sound. There was no chorus of birds, no rustle of leaves stirred by a breeze. Instead, light arrived quietly, thinning the darkness until shapes slowly returned, first as shadows, then as solid forms. The surveyor woke before the sun cleared the horizon, his body already attuned to the rhythm of heat and rest. The air was cool, almost cold, carrying a faint mineral scent that clung to the inside of his lungs with each slow breath. He lay still for a moment, listening to nothing in particular, aware of the vastness surrounding him. The ground beneath his bedroll was firm and unforgiving, every small stone pressing through the fabric. He shifted slightly, feeling the stiffness in his back and shoulders, the dull ache of muscles used steadily the day before. Fatigue was present, but it was a familiar weight now, not alarming, simply there, like the desert itself. Rising came in stages. He sat up first, letting his balance settle, then stood, boots finding their place in the dust without urgency. The world was washed in pale gray, the sun still hidden but already influencing everything it touched. He rolled his shoulders slowly, joints creaking faintly, then reached for his canteen. The water inside was cool, having held on to the night's chill. He drank sparingly, each swallow measured, aware of how precious that simple relief was. There was comfort in routine. He folded his bedroll carefully, movements practiced and economical, then secured it to his pack. Tools were checked one by one, fingers brushing familiar shapes and textures. The transit's metal was cold against his skin, the leather straps dry and stiff. He wiped dust from the lenses with a cloth, the gesture almost ceremonial. These small acts grounded him, giving the morning structure before the heat erased all softness from the day. As the sun finally rose, it did so without drama, lifting itself above the horizon in a steady arc. Almost immediately, the temperature began to climb. The desert seemed to awaken reluctantly, light revealing details that had been hidden, fine cracks in the earth, scattered stones, the faint tracks of some small animal that had passed through during the night. Nothing lingered long here. The land erased evidence quickly. He set out again, walking at a pace that felt almost slow, but was deliberate. Each step was placed with intention, conserving energy, maintaining balance. The sound of his boots against the ground was muted, absorbed by sand and dust. The silence wrapped around him fully now, complete and unbroken, a presence that pressed gently but persistently against his thoughts. Hours passed marked only by the position of the sun and the steady progression of his work. He stopped, measured, noted figures in his book, then moved on. The act repeated itself until it began to feel timeless, as though it had always been this way and always would be. The desert offered no landmarks that felt permanent, only subtle variations in color and texture that required attention to notice. By late morning, heat shimmered above the ground, bending the air and distorting distance. The horizon wavered, refusing to stay still. Sweat formed and vanished quickly, leaving his skin dry and tight. His shirt clung to him briefly, then stiffened as salt dried into the fabric. The weight of his pack pressed down steadily, a reminder of gravity in a place that otherwise felt unanchored. When he paused to rest, it was not because of exhaustion, but because rest was part of survival. He stood in the narrow shade cast by his own body, the sun directly overhead, and let his breathing slow. The air tasted flat, stripped of moisture, carrying only dust and heat. He closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to reduce the strain of constant brightness. The desert did not change its tone as the day advanced. There was no escalation, no sudden challenge, only the steady continuation of conditions that demanded respect. He resumed his work without hurry, trusting the rhythm he had established. Each measurement felt heavier now, not physically, but mentally. Concentration required more effort, thoughts drifting more easily toward nothing in particular. By early afternoon, fatigue settled deeper into his muscles. It was not sharp or overwhelming, but it was persistent, a low hum beneath every movement. His legs felt thick, less responsive, and he adjusted his stride accordingly. The heat seemed to press closer, narrowing the world to a smaller circle around him. Beyond that circle, the land blurred and softened, becoming almost abstract. He reached another planned stopping point and lowered himself to the ground with care. Sitting brought immediate relief, though standing again would be harder. He removed his hat and wiped his forehead with his sleeve, the gesture slow and unhurried. His canteen was lighter now, its contents reduced, and he took only a small sip before sealing it again. Time behaved strangely in the afternoon. Minutes stretched, then collapsed, leaving him unsure how long he had been sitting. The sun's position offered some guidance, but even that felt unreliable, distorted by heat and distance. He occupied himself with small tasks, adjusting straps, checking notes, making sure nothing had shifted or loosened. These actions required little thought, but provided focus. Eventually, he rose and continued on, knowing he needed to reach his next camp before nightfall. The sun began its slow descent, and with it came a subtle change. The heat eased just enough to be noticeable, though it remained heavy. Shadows lengthened, giving the land depth again, restoring definition to rocks and ridges that had flattened under midday glare. As evening approached, the desert seemed to exhale. The oppressive stillness softened, replaced by a gentler quiet. The air cooled gradually, touching his skin with a faint relief that spread inward. He felt his shoulders drop slightly, tension releasing as the day loosened its grip. He made camp near a low rise, choosing a spot that offered a sense of enclosure without blocking the sky. The ground was hard, but even, and he welcomed the chance to stop moving. He set his pack down and sat beside it, legs extended, boots still on. The ache in his feet and calves became more pronounced now that he was still, but it was a satisfying ache, earned and familiar. There was no fire to tend, no elaborate meal to prepare. He ate simply, slowly, letting the warmth of the food contrast with the cooling air. Each bite grounded him, connecting effort to reward in a direct, uncomplicated way. The sky shifted again, colors deepening, then fading into gray and blue as the sun slipped away. Night settled in gradually, carrying a chill that crept up from the ground. He pulled his jacket tighter, the fabric rough against his skin, and lay back, eyes tracing the emerging stars. They appeared one by one, then in clusters, until the sky was crowded with light. The clarity was striking, each star sharp and unwavering, unaffected by the distance they represented. He felt very small then, but not insignificant. There was a difference, one he had learned to recognize. The desert reduced everything to essentials, stripping away excess thought and concern. Out here, existence was simple: move, measure, rest, repeat. The complexity of the world beyond felt distant and unreal. As he prepared for sleep, his movements slowed further, guided by habit rather than intention. He arranged his bedroll, eased himself down, and stared upward one last time. The air was cold now, clean and sharp, filling his lungs deeply. His body welcomed the stillness, muscles relaxing as fatigue finally took precedence. Thoughts drifted lazily, unformed. Figures from the day floated through his mind, then dissolved. There was no anxiety about tomorrow, only an acceptance that it would arrive much like today had, demanding the same steady effort. He closed his eyes, listening to the sound of his own breathing, even in calm. The desert held him there, suspended between earth and sky, between effort and rest. Nothing moved. Nothing needed to. Sleep came without resistance, deep and quiet, carrying him through the night as the land remained unchanged, patient and vast, waiting for the cycle to begin again with the next soft return of light. By the third stretch of days in the desert, fatigue no longer arrived in clear moments. It did not announce itself in the way it had at the beginning, with heavy limbs or a sharp need to stop. Instead, it settled everywhere at once, a fine layer that coated thought, movement, and perception alike. The surveyor woke before dawn as he always did, but now the act of opening his eyes felt slower, as though sleep still held on to him with gentle insistence. The night had been cold, colder than he remembered from earlier camps. The ground had drawn heat steadily from his body, and even wrapped in his bedroll, he felt the lingering chill in his bones. When he sat up, his joints protested softly, stiffness radiating through his knees, hips, and shoulders. He paused there, breathing evenly, allowing warmth to return gradually before asking anything more of himself. The sky was still dark, stars fading reluctantly as the first hint of light crept up from the horizon. The air carried a dry, brittle cold that sharpened the senses even as it made movement uncomfortable. He rubbed his hands together slowly, feeling rough skin scrape against itself, then reached for his canteen. The water was cold enough to sting slightly as he swallowed, a reminder of the night that had passed. Breaking camp took longer now. Not because he had forgotten how, but because every motion required a conscious decision. He folded his bedroll carefully, but his fingers felt less precise, slightly dulled. The straps resisted more than they used to, or perhaps it was simply that his hands lacked their former strength. He adjusted, retightened, and accepted the slower pace without frustration. As the sun rose, it brought warmth almost immediately, cutting through the cold with surprising speed. The transition was abrupt enough to be disorienting. Within minutes, the chill retreated, replaced by a growing pressure of heat that seemed to push down from above and up from the ground at the same time. He stood still for a moment, letting his body recalibrate, then set out once more. Walking felt different now. His stride shortened slightly, steps landing heavier than before. The desert remained unchanged, vast and indifferent, but his perception of it had shifted. Distances seemed longer, angles less certain. He relied more heavily on his instruments, trusting metal and glass over instinct. When he stopped to measure, he took extra care, double-checking alignments, aware that fatigue could blur judgment. The silence pressed closer than ever. It no longer felt neutral, but thick, almost viscous, as though sound itself had been absorbed by the land. Even his own breathing seemed muted, internal rather than external. He became acutely aware of small sensations, the way dust worked its way into seams of clothing, the faint rasp of fabric against skin, the steady pulse in his temples that rose with the heat. By mid-morning, the sun hung high, and the air shimmered constantly. The horizon wavered, refusing to settle, creating the impression that the world itself was unstable. He blinked often, eyes dry and irritated, and pulled his hat lower to shade his face. Sweat appeared and vanished in the same moment, leaving behind tightness and a faint burning itch. He paused more frequently now, not to rest fully, but to reset. Each stop was brief. Standing still too long made it harder to start again. When he did stop, he focused on breathing, drawing air in slowly, releasing it just as deliberately. The desert rewarded this restraint. Pushing too hard brought only faster exhaustion. Thoughts wandered more easily. Numbers from his notebook blurred together, losing their meaning for moments at a time. He caught himself staring at the page without writing, pencil hovering uselessly above paper. When that happened, he closed the book, waited, and then returned to it only when clarity returned. Patience had become a necessity, not a virtue. The hours passed without distinction. Morning gave way to afternoon almost without notice. The sun's descent was slow and deceptive, offering little immediate relief. Heat lingered, clinging stubbornly to the land. His body felt heavier now, as though gravity itself had increased. Each step demanded more effort than the last, not painfully, but insistently. He reached a small rise late in the day and stopped there longer than planned. From that vantage point, the desert stretched in every direction, uninterrupted and immense. There was no visible progress to measure, no marker to confirm how far he had come. The realization brought no panic, only a quiet weariness that settled deeper into his chest. Sitting down, he removed his pack and let it rest beside him. The relief was immediate, shoulders loosening as the weight lifted away. He flexed his fingers slowly, watching them respond with slight delay. The skin was cracked and rough, marked by dust and sun. These hands had measured miles of emptiness, translated silence into numbers. He ate slowly, chewing each bite with care. Food tasted less vivid now, more functional than satisfying. Still, the act of eating restored something essential, a small reservoir of energy that allowed him to continue. He drank sparingly, conscious of the diminishing supply, feeling the water move through him like a quiet promise. As evening approached, the desert softened again. Shadows lengthened, edges sharpened. The air cooled just enough to ease the pressure on his skin. He stood, gathered his pack, and continued on at a measured pace, eyes scanning for a suitable place to stop for the night. When he found it, he did not hesitate. The spot offered no special features, just level ground and a slight sense of enclosure. That was enough. He lowered himself carefully, movements slow and deliberate, then lay back, staring upward as the sky deepened in color. Night arrived without ceremony. Stars emerged gradually, filling the darkness until it felt crowded with light. The temperature dropped steadily, and he welcomed it, pulling his jacket tighter, feeling the cool air soothe skin that had burned all day. Fatigue settled fully now, no longer background, but central, a deep and encompassing presence. Lying there, he felt the day's effort register in every part of his body. Muscles pulsed faintly, joints ached dully. There was no sharp pain, only a pervasive heaviness that made even small adjustments feel unnecessary. He allowed himself to be still, breathing slowly, deeply, each breath a quiet affirmation that he was where he needed to be. Thoughts drifted in and out without structure. Memories surfaced briefly, then faded. The sound of wind brushing over distant ground reached him faintly, more felt than heard. The desert seemed to hum at a frequency just below awareness, a constant, steady presence that filled the silence. Sleep did not come immediately. Instead, he hovered in a space between rest and waking, eyes closed, senses dulled but alert. Time stretched thin there, moments dissolving into one another. When sleep finally arrived, it was deep and heavy, pulling him down gently but firmly. He woke once during the night, uncertain why. The stars had shifted slightly, the sky rotating slowly overhead. The air was cold enough to make him draw his jacket closer. He listened, finding no sound beyond his own breathing. Satisfied, he closed his eyes again, sinking back into sleep without resistance. Morning came again, as it always did, light returning quietly. When he opened his eyes, the fatigue remained, but it felt different now. Not heavier, but broader, spread evenly through him. It no longer demanded attention, it simply existed. He rose slowly, body stiff but functional, and began the familiar routine once more. There was comfort in repetition, in knowing exactly what the next hours would bring. The desert waited, unchanged and patient, and he stepped back into it with measured resolve. As he walked, the sun climbing once more, he accepted the weariness as part of the work, part of the landscape. It was not an enemy to be fought, but a condition to be managed. He adjusted his pace, his expectations, his thoughts, moving forward steadily, quietly, carrying the weight of the days behind him as the desert stretched endlessly ahead. The final nights in the desert did not feel like endings. They felt like a continuation that had slowly learned how to breathe on its own. By then, the surveyor's body no longer resisted the rhythm imposed upon it. Waking, walking, measuring, resting, and sleeping had merged into a single, unbroken flow, each part feeding quietly into the next. Fatigue was no longer something that arrived, it was simply present, settled deep and evenly, like the land itself. He woke before dawn as usual, but this time there was no urgency in the moment. The darkness was familiar, almost welcoming. The air carried a steady coolness, no longer biting, just firm and clear. He lay still for a while, listening to his own breath move in and out, slow and even, feeling the ground beneath him, solid and dependable. His body felt heavy, but not strained. It was the weight of long use, not of injury. When he sat up, the movement was careful and practiced. Joints protested faintly, then settled. Muscles responded without surprise. He reached for his jacket and pulled it close, the fabric worn smooth by repeated use. His hands moved over familiar surfaces, straps, buckles, edges of tools, each touch confirming that everything was where it should be. There was comfort in that certainty. The sky began to lighten almost imperceptibly. Darkness thinned into a deep blue, then softened further. Stars faded slowly, reluctant to leave. The desert revealed itself again in muted tones, shapes emerging without sharpness. He rose to his feet and stood quietly, allowing the transition from rest to movement to complete itself without force. Breaking camp took place in silence, as it always had. Each motion was economical, stripped of excess. He folded his bedroll, secured his pack, checked his instruments. There was no need to rush. Time felt expansive now, less like something that pressed forward and more like something that simply existed. As the sun rose, warmth followed, but gently this time. The harsh edge it once carried seemed dulled, or perhaps his body had learned how to receive it. He began walking, step steady and unhurried, the familiar crunch of ground beneath his boots grounding him in the moment. The desert stretched out ahead, unchanged, vast, patient. He worked through the morning as he had so many times before, stopping to measure, to note, to confirm. The act had become almost meditative. Numbers flowed easily now, no longer demanding the intense focus they once had. His mind moved more slowly, but with clarity. Each task completed felt complete, needing no further thought. The silence no longer pressed in on him. It had become a backdrop, a constant presence that asked nothing. Even the sound of his own breathing blended into it seamlessly. The desert no longer felt empty. It felt full, complete unto itself, and he was simply passing through. By midday, the sun was high, but the heat did not overwhelm. He paused as needed, resting briefly in what little shade he could find or create. His body recognized its limits instinctively now, adjusting without conscious effort. There was no struggle in this. Only cooperation between effort and rest. When he drank, the water felt less like relief and more like balance, restoring what had been spent. He ate slowly, not out of hunger alone, but out of routine. Each action was deliberate, unhurried, and sufficient. As afternoon wore on, fatigue deepened again, but it was a soft fatigue, one that encouraged stillness rather than collapse. His movements slowed slightly, but remained steady. The land around him shimmered faintly in the heat, but he no longer chased clarity at the horizon. He accepted the mirage-like quality of distance, trusting his instruments and his experience. Late in the day, he reached a point that marked the end of this stretch of work. There was no sign to announce it, no dramatic shift in the land. Only the quiet knowledge, confirmed by numbers and notes, that this section was complete. He set his pack down and sat, letting the moment settle. The desert around him remained unchanged, indifferent to his sense of completion. But within him, something eased. A long-held tension released, subtle but unmistakable. He stayed there for a while, watching shadows lengthen, feeling the heat recede gradually from the ground. As evening arrived, the air cooled again, wrapping around him with familiar gentleness. He prepared his final camp in this place with the same care he always had, though his movements were slower now, guided more by habit than thought. When he lay back, the ground felt solid, reassuring. The sky darkened gradually, revealing stars one by one. They filled the space above him completely, sharp and unwavering. He watched them in silence, breathing deeply, feeling the fatigue settle fully into his body. Muscles relaxed. Thoughts slowed until they barely registered. There was a profound stillness in that moment, a sense of having arrived not at a destination, but at an understanding. The desert had taken time from him, energy, focus. In return, it had given him something quieter, less definable. A steadiness. A recalibration of scale. As sleep approached, it did so gently, without pulling. His eyelids grew heavy, closing not out of necessity, but out of readiness. The sounds around him were minimal, almost non-existent. A faint movement of air. The subtle shift of fabric as he adjusted his position. Then nothing. Sleep carried him deeply, smoothly. Hours passed unnoticed. When he woke briefly in the night, the stars had shifted again, marking time in their slow, reliable way. The air was cool and clean. He adjusted his jacket, then drifted back into rest without resistance. Morning returned quietly, as it always did. Light filtered back into the world, revealing the same land, the same sky. He woke with a sense of completeness, fatigue still present but no longer heavy. It felt earned, settled, part of him. He rose for the last time in this place and stood, taking in the view without expectation. The desert stretched endlessly, unchanged by his presence, yet he knew he would not see it the same way again. He gathered his things slowly, deliberately, honoring the routine that had carried him through. As he began to walk, turning toward the distant point that would eventually lead him back to others, his steps were measured and calm. There was no rush to leave, no hesitation to stay. The desert had taught him its rhythm, and he carried that rhythm with him now. The sun climbed, warming the ground, casting familiar shadows. The silence remained, vast and complete. He moved forward steadily, breathing evenly, body aligned with effort and rest. Behind him, the land remained as it always had, patient and unmoved. Ahead, the path unfolded without drama. And within him, the slow, grounded cadence of those days and nights lingered, a quiet companion that required nothing, offering steadiness in return. As the hours passed and the distance behind him grew, the desert did not fade from memory. It settled instead, deep and enduring, like the fatigue in his bones and the calm in his breath, becoming part of the way he moved through the world, even as sleep waited gently, ready to take him again when the day finally came to rest. I'll answer as a world-famous narrative storyteller and sleep audio writer specializing in long-form masculine narration, recipient of the PN America Literary Award for Spoken Fiction. What if the moment that changed everything in your life didn't arrive with noise or drama, but with silence, so complete that you only noticed it years later, when you tried to remember who you used to be? What if the real turning points were not the days people talk about, not weddings or funerals or promotions or losses, but an ordinary afternoon when nothing seemed to happen at all? This story begins on such a day, in a place most men pass without looking twice, a place built to be temporary, yet somehow still standing decades later, like a thought you never finished thinking. The motel sat just off the highway, far enough back that the traffic sounded like distant water moving over stone, close enough that the air always smelled faintly of hot rubber and dust. Its sign flickered even in daylight, one letter occasionally dimming and then returning, as if the building itself were breathing slowly, unevenly, tired but persistent. You could tell how old it was by the way the paint had softened, losing its edges, colors blending into each other the way memories do when you stop rehearsing them. Nothing about the place invited you in, but nothing pushed you away either, and for a man who had been driving since before sunrise, that was enough. Inside the room, the air carried the stale coolness of an air conditioner that had never quite been turned off, mixed with the faint sweetness of old soap and sun-warmed fabric. The carpet pressed flat underfoot, worn smooth by thousands of steps that all led nowhere in particular. The bedspread had a pattern that tried too hard to look cheerful, faded oranges and browns repeating endlessly, like a promise that had once sounded convincing. When you sat on the edge of the bed, it dipped just slightly, as if acknowledging your weight, your presence, your need to rest without asking questions. Outside, the afternoon stretched long and pale. The sky was washed out, a thin blue like denim left too many days in the sun. Heat shimmered above the asphalt, bending the distance, making everything ahead seem further away than it was. Somewhere beyond the parking lot, cicadas droned in steady, mechanical rhythm, their sound rising and falling in waves that made time feel thicker, slower. It was the kind of sound you didn't listen to so much as sink into, the way you sink into a chair at the end of a long day. The man in the room had reached an age where silence felt earned. Not empty, not uncomfortable, but full in a way that younger men rarely understand. He had spent decades filling spaces with explanations, with plans, with justifications, with words meant to reassure others or himself. Now, sitting there with his hands resting loosely on his thighs, he allowed the quiet to exist without interruption. He noticed the faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional click as it adjusted itself, the distant thud of a car door closing somewhere across the lot. Each sound arrived, lingered, and faded without demanding a response. He had not planned to stop here. That was the truth of it. The stop was unplanned in the same way many important things are unplanned, emerging not from decision but from fatigue, from a subtle internal shift where the body speaks first and the mind agrees later. His shoulders had begun to ache somewhere miles back, a deep, spreading heaviness that made gripping the steering wheel feel like work instead of habit. His eyes had burned just enough to suggest that continuing would cost more than it was worth. When the sign appeared, flickering in the heat, he had turned the wheel without thinking too hard about it. As the afternoon wore on, light crept slowly across the room, inching along the wall, climbing the leg of the bedside table, catching briefly on the metal edge of a lamp before moving on. Dust floated lazily in the beam, each particle visible for a moment before drifting back into invisibility. The man lay back on the bed without removing his shoes, arms folded loosely across his chest, staring at the ceiling where a faint crack traced a crooked line from one corner toward the center, stopping as if it had lost interest. He followed that line with his eyes, not trying to interpret it, just letting his gaze move. Memories, when they came, did not arrive in order. They rarely do. They came as sensations first, the remembered weight of a toolbox carried up a flight of stairs, the smell of cut grass early in the morning, the sound of a screen door slamming somewhere behind him while he walked away without turning back. These fragments floated through his mind without attaching themselves to dates or explanations. He did not resist them. He let them pass, the way you let weather move through a landscape, knowing it will change but not needing to control how. He thought about the road behind him, miles of it unspooling quietly, each stretch identical in its own way, yet never repeated exactly. He had driven roads like this for years, chasing deadlines, obligations, expectations that once felt urgent and now felt distant, as if they belonged to another man entirely. There had been a time when motion itself felt like purpose, when stopping felt dangerous, like admitting something he was not ready to admit. Now, lying still, he felt no such threat. Stillness felt earned, like a reward you only understand after you no longer need it. As evening approached, the air changed. The heat softened, losing its sharp edge, settling into a warm, enveloping presence. The cicadas grew louder for a while, then gradually eased, their rhythm slowing as the light dimmed. Shadows lengthened across the parking lot, stretching from the undersides of cars, pooling beneath them like dark water. Somewhere nearby, someone laughed briefly, the sound carrying and then cutting off abruptly, leaving the quiet intact. The man rose slowly, joints protesting just enough to remind him of time's steady work. He walked to the door and stepped outside, letting the evening air touch his face. It smelled different now, cooler, tinged with the faint promise of night. The sky had deepened, blue giving way to something richer, more forgiving. A single bird crossed overhead, its wings beating steadily, unhurried, as if it knew exactly where it was going and saw no reason to rush. He leaned against the railing that ran along the front of the rooms, the metal cool beneath his forearms. From here, the highway was visible through a gap in the trees, a ribbon of motion and sound, headlights beginning to appear as small, distant points. Each car carried its own story, its own urgency, its own reasons for moving forward. He watched without envy, without judgment, simply acknowledging their passage the way one acknowledges the passage of years. When darkness finally settled, it did so gently. The motel lights clicked on one by one, casting soft yellow pools on the concrete. Moths gathered around them, fluttering with quiet determination, their movements erratic yet purposeful. The flickering sign buzzed faintly now, its light more noticeable against the dark, still missing that one letter, still trying to say something it could no longer fully express. Back inside, the room felt different, smaller, more intimate. The sounds outside were muted, softened by distance and walls. The man sat at the small table by the window, hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee he had poured from the machine near the office. It was thin and slightly bitter, but warm, and that was enough. He sipped slowly, feeling the heat spread, settle, ease something inside him that had been tight for longer than he could remember. He thought, briefly, about the morning ahead. About getting back on the road, merging once more into the flow of movement. But the thought did not carry weight yet. It hovered at the edge of his awareness, acknowledged but not engaged. For now, there was only this room, this night, this quiet stretch of time that belonged to no one else. As he lay down again, the bed creaking softly beneath him, he noticed the simple comfort of the pillow, the way it supported his head without effort. His breathing slowed, deepened, each inhale steady, each exhale unforced. The ceiling fan turned lazily, pushing air in slow circles, its faint rhythmic sound blending with the distant hum of the highway until it all became a single, continuous presence. Sleep did not come immediately, but rest did. A deep, settling rest that did not demand unconsciousness, only surrender. His thoughts loosened their grip, drifting without direction, without urgency. The day released him, minute by minute, and in that release, something unspoken began to take shape, something that would matter later, though he could not yet name it. For now, there was only the knowledge that stopping had been the right choice, that this unremarkable place had offered exactly what was needed. The road would wait. It always did. And in the quiet space between movement and sleep, the story truly began, not with answers, but with the rare and valuable permission to simply be. The night deepened in layers, not all at once, but gradually, the way fatigue settles into the muscles after a long day of work, first barely noticeable, then unmistakable. Somewhere in the distance, clouds gathered without ceremony, and the air inside the room grew heavier, holding on to warmth even as the temperature slipped downward. The man slept lightly at first, drifting in and out, aware of the bed beneath him, the faint pressure of the blanket against his legs, the steady rise and fall of his chest. Outside, the highway never truly slept, but its sound softened, becoming a low, continuous hush that blended with the hum of the fan until it felt less like noise and more like presence. Rain began without warning, not in a dramatic burst, but as a tentative tapping on the roof, individual drops spaced far enough apart to be counted if one were inclined to count them. Each drop landed with a small, hollow sound, metal answering water, until the pattern thickened and the spaces between impacts disappeared. Soon the roof carried a steady rhythm, rain sliding down its slope, gathering in the gutters, spilling over the edges in narrow streams that splashed onto the concrete below. The smell of rain worked its way into the room through tiny, unseen gaps, carrying with it the clean, mineral scent of wet dust and cooling asphalt. The man stirred, not fully awake, but aware of the change. His breathing adjusted instinctively, deepening, syncing itself to the cadence of the rain. In sleep, his mind wandered through familiar territory without urgency, revisiting places he had not seen in years, a back porch with warped boards warm under bare feet, a garage lit by a single bulb swinging slightly from its cord, the smell of oil and old wood hanging in the air. These images did not demand attention. They appeared and faded, like reflections on water disturbed by a passing breeze. At some point, he woke fully, eyes opening to the dim glow of the room. The clock on the bedside table read just past 3, its red numbers soft and unfocused until he blinked. He lay still, listening. The rain had settled into a steady downpour now, no longer tentative, confident in its presence. Water rushed through the gutters with a low, gurgling sound, and somewhere nearby, a loose piece of metal tapped gently, over and over, not loud enough to annoy, just enough to notice. It was the kind of sound that, once noticed, became part of the landscape, easily accepted. He shifted slightly, the mattress responding with a muted sigh. The muscles in his back loosened as he adjusted his position, finding a place where the weight of his body felt evenly distributed, supported without resistance. He noticed the simple comfort of being warm while the rain cooled the world outside, the quiet satisfaction of shelter earned not through effort but through chance. His eyelids grew heavy again, and he let them close, the darkness behind them softer than before. Sleep returned, deeper this time, carrying him along slowly, like a current that did not rush. In this deeper rest, time lost its edges. There was no clear before or after, only a continuous sense of being held, suspended between wakefulness and dream. The rain continued its work outside, washing dust from leaves, darkening the earth, settling things into place. Inside, the man's body followed its own rhythms, breath steady, heartbeat slow and reliable, a quiet engine that had carried him through years of labor, worry, and persistence. Morning announced itself subtly. The rain eased first, tapering off into a fine mist that hung in the air before drifting away. Light crept back into the sky, pale and tentative, seeping through the thin curtains and painting the walls in soft gray. Birds began to call from somewhere beyond the parking lot, their voices clear and unhurried, each note placed with care. The man woke to these sounds gradually, consciousness returning not as a jolt but as a gentle unfolding. He sat up slowly, rubbing a hand over his face, feeling the roughness of stubble beneath his fingers. The air felt cooler now, refreshed, carrying the faint scent of wet ground and leaves. For a moment, he simply sat there, feet on the floor, grounding himself in the present. The carpet was cool against his soles, slightly damp from the night's humidity, a reminder of the weather's quiet passage. He stretched without hurry, joints responding with mild stiffness that eased as he moved. Outside, the world looked washed clean. The concrete glistened, reflecting the pale morning sky. Puddles collected in shallow depressions, their surfaces smooth and unbroken, mirroring the motel's lights now turned off, the sign still flickering faintly, stubborn in its routine. The man stepped out onto the walkway, drawing a deep breath. The air filled his lungs easily, cool and satisfying, carrying with it a sense of renewal that required no interpretation. He walked slowly toward his car, the gravel crunching softly beneath his steps. Each sound felt amplified in the morning quiet, distinct and clear. He unlocked the door but did not get in right away. Instead, he leaned against the hood, hands resting on the cool metal, and looked out toward the trees at the edge of the property. Drops of water clung to the leaves, catching the light, trembling slightly before falling. The scene held a simple beauty, unremarkable and complete. Returning to the room, he gathered his few belongings without rush. The movements were familiar, practiced over years of travel, yet unhurried now. He noticed small details he might have overlooked before, the way the zipper on his bag sounded louder in the quiet room, the faint imprint his body had left on the pillow, already fading. He paused by the door for a moment, hand on the handle, taking one last look around. The room had served its purpose without ceremony, offering rest and nothing more, and that was enough. At the small office, the clerk sat behind the counter, a man not much younger than himself, eyes calm, movements efficient. They exchanged a nod, a few quiet words, nothing unnecessary. The transaction was simple, almost ritualistic, a brief acknowledgement that paths had crossed and would now diverge. The man stepped back outside, keys in hand, the sound of them jangling softly as he walked. The road waited, dark and damp, stretching out ahead. As he drove, the tires hummed against the wet surface, sending up a fine spray that caught the light behind him. The landscape rolled past at a steady pace, fields and trees still heavy with moisture, the sky gradually brightening above. He kept the radio off, preferring the sound of the engine, the tires, the wind moving around the car. These sounds required no attention, no response, allowing his mind to remain open and unburdened. Fatigue lingered, but it was different now, softened by rest, no longer sharp or insistent. It sat comfortably, like a well-worn coat, familiar and reassuring. He felt no need to hurry, no pressure to arrive sooner than necessary. The road would unfold as it always had, mile after mile, and he would meet it at his own pace. As the morning wore on, the sun broke through the clouds, its light gentle rather than harsh, warming the world without overwhelming it. Steam rose from the fields, thin and ephemeral, dissolving as quickly as it appeared. The man's thoughts drifted again, but this time they carried less weight. There was room between them, space to breathe. He thought about the years behind him, not with regret or longing, but with a quiet acknowledgement, as one acknowledges a long day's work done well enough. He did not know what awaited him down the road, and for once, that uncertainty felt acceptable. There was comfort in the simple act of moving forward, not towards something specific, but away from nothing in particular. The memory of the rain, the room, the night's deep rest stayed with him, a subtle presence, like the lingering warmth of a fire long after the flames have died down. By the time the motel was far behind him, reduced to a forgotten turn-off, the experience had already begun to settle into memory, its edges softening. Yet something of it remained, woven into his awareness, a reminder that stopping was allowed, that rest was not weakness, that the quiet moments mattered just as much as the long miles driven in between. The road stretched on, steady and patient, and the man followed it, unhurried, carrying with him the calm of rain on a metal roof, the comfort of a worn bed, and the deep, grounding knowledge that for a while, at least, he was exactly where he needed to be. The afternoon thinned out slowly, not by any clear signal, but by a subtle easing of light and sound, as if the day itself were loosening its grip. Clouds drifted low and wide, stretched thin across the sky like worn cotton, their edges soft and undefined. The man had been driving for hours again, not because he was in a hurry, but because movement felt easier than stopping. The road hummed beneath the tires, a steady vibration that traveled up through the steering wheel and into his arms, settling there like a familiar weight. It was the kind of sound that did not demand attention, a background presence that allowed the mind to drift without losing its footing. By the time he pulled off the highway, the light had turned muted and gray, the kind of light that made distances seem longer and shapes less certain. The place he chose was not marked by anything memorable, just a narrow road branching off into trees, leading toward a small clearing where a weathered cabin stood alone. The structure had been there a long time, its wood darkened by years of rain and sun, the boards slightly warped, their grain raised and rough to the touch. He parked nearby and sat for a moment with the engine off, listening as the ticking metal cooled, each soft click a sign that motion had finally given way to stillness. The air smelled different here. Damp earth, old leaves, and a faint trace of smoke lingered together, not fresh, but not unpleasant either, like the memory of a fire burned hours ago. When he stepped out of the car, the ground gave slightly beneath his boots, soft with moisture, and he adjusted his balance without thinking. The trees around the clearing stood tall and quiet, their branches barely moving, though the air itself felt alive, cool against his face and neck. Inside the cabin, the temperature was lower than outside, the kind of cool that settled into the bones at first and then became comforting once the body adjusted. The floorboards creaked softly under his weight, each sound distinct, as if the place were acknowledging his presence without objection. Light filtered in through small windows, dim and diffuse, catching dust motes that drifted lazily through the air. He set his bag down and took a slow breath, filling his lungs with the scent of aged wood and lingering smoke. He moved through the space without urgency, hands brushing against surfaces worn smooth by time and use. The table bore faint marks, shallow grooves and scratches that spoke of years of meals, tools, and idle moments. A chair near the wall held the faint impression of countless others who had rested there before him. He ran his fingers along the back of it, feeling the rounded edges, the slight unevenness where repairs had been made long ago. Outside, the wind picked up just enough to stir the leaves, setting them whispering softly, a low, continuous sound that wrapped itself around the cabin. He opened the small stove and laid a few pieces of wood inside, their surfaces dry and splintered, smelling faintly of sap. When he struck the match, the flame flared briefly, then settled, catching the kindling with a quiet determination. Soon, the fire established itself, crackling gently, sending thin threads of smoke upward before the draft carried them away. The warmth spread slowly, not in waves, but in a steady, patient way. He stood near the stove, hands extended, palms open, feeling the heat seep into his skin, easing the stiffness in his fingers. The fire's sound was steady and reassuring, each pop and sigh a reminder that something simple and contained was happening, requiring no thought beyond occasional attention. As evening deepened, the light outside faded further, until the windows reflected more of the cabin's interior than the world beyond. Shadows gathered in corners, soft and unthreatening, stretching and shifting with the movement of the flames. He sat down heavily in the chair, the wood solid beneath him, supporting his weight without complaint. Fatigue settled into his shoulders and back, a familiar ache that carried with it no urgency, only the quiet acknowledgement of time spent and effort given. Rain began again sometime after dark, this time more gently than before. It tapped against the roof in an irregular pattern, each drop distinct, the pauses between them long enough to notice. The sound blended with the crackle of the fire, creating a layered rhythm that filled the cabin without overwhelming it. The smell of rain joined the smoke, drifting in through small gaps, cool and clean. His breathing slowed without conscious effort, deepening as his body responded to the warmth and the quiet. Thoughts moved through his mind lazily, no longer sharp or demanding. He remembered other nights like this, not specific ones, but the general feeling of them, the sense of being removed from obligation, held in a space where nothing was required. Those memories did not arrive with emotion, just a gentle recognition, like nodding to an old acquaintance across a room. The chair creaked softly as he shifted, settling more fully into it. The firelight flickered across his hands, highlighting the lines and scars that told their own quiet stories. He studied them for a moment, not with judgment, but with simple awareness. These were hands that had built, fixed, carried, and held, hands that had learned the shape of effort and endurance over years. Outside, the rain steadied, its rhythm becoming more consistent, less tentative. Water ran down the roof and dropped from the eaves in slow, measured drips. Somewhere nearby, a branch shifted and settled, the sound muffled by distance and dampness. The forest seemed to exhale, releasing the day's remaining warmth and tension into the night. He closed his eyes, not to sleep yet, but to rest them, letting the darkness behind his lids deepen. The fire continued its quiet work, the stove radiating warmth that pressed gently against his legs and chest. Each breath felt full and unforced, the air moving in and out with ease. The weight of the day receded further, leaving behind a calm heaviness that was almost pleasant. Time lost its clarity. Minutes and hours blended together, marked only by the occasional shift of the fire or a change in the rain's intensity. When he opened his eyes again, the fire had burned down slightly, the flames lower, the glow deeper and redder. He stood slowly, joints responding with mild protest that faded as he straightened. Adding another log to the stove, he watched as the fire accepted it, flames licking along the edges, gradually claiming it as their own. The simple act felt grounding. There was no rush, no need to optimize or hurry. Everything happened at its own pace, and that pace felt right. He returned to the chair, sitting back down with a long, steady exhale, as if releasing something he hadn't realized he was holding. Later, when sleep finally came, it did so gently. His head rested against the chair's back, neck supported just enough, the warmth of the fire and the sound of rain weaving together into a steady lull. Dreams, if they came, were soft and indistinct, more like sensations than images. A feeling of floating, of being carried, of not needing to decide what came next. The night passed without interruption. The rain eased, then returned briefly, then faded again. The fire burned low, its warmth lingering even as the flames diminished. The cabin held the heat, the smell of smoke settling into the wood, becoming part of it once more. When morning arrived, it did not announce itself loudly. Light seeped back into the world gradually, pale and cool, filtering through the windows and touching the edges of things. He woke slowly, awareness returning in layers. The chair beneath him, the quiet of the cabin, the faint smell of ash and damp earth all came into focus one by one. He stood and stretched, feeling the stiffness ease as he moved. Outside, the forest looked washed clean, leaves dark and glossy, the ground rich with moisture. Mist hovered low, drifting between the trees, softening their outlines. He stepped out onto the porch, the wood cool beneath his boots, and breathed deeply. There was no particular thought in his mind, no plan pressing for attention. Just the simple presence of the morning, the knowledge that he had rested, that the night had passed gently, that for now, this was enough. The night settled in fully, not with a sharp edge, but like a heavy blanket lowered inch by inch over the land. Darkness gathered in the trees first, pooling between trunks and under branches, until even familiar shapes lost their certainty. The cabin remained a quiet island in that darkness, its walls holding the last warmth of the day, its timbers breathing softly as the temperature dropped. Inside, the fire had burned down to a low, steady glow, no longer eager, no longer bright, but dependable, a bed of coals that pulsed with dull red light each time a log shifted inside. He sat close to it, not because he needed the heat urgently, but because its presence felt right, like sitting near an old friend who didn't require conversation. The chair creaked faintly as he adjusted his weight, the sound small and familiar, swallowed almost immediately by the quiet. His boots rested flat on the floor, the leather scuffed and softened by years of use, their soles still cool from the damp ground outside. The smell of smoke clung to them, mingling with the deeper scent of the cabin itself, old wood, ash, and time. Outside, the wind moved through the forest with slow patience. It did not howl or rush. It simply passed between branches, brushing leaves together, creating a low, continuous murmur that rose and fell without pattern. Every now and then, a drop of water fell from a leaf or an eave, striking the ground with a soft, isolated sound. The world seemed to be speaking quietly to itself, unconcerned with being heard. His breathing had grown slow and even. Each breath filled his chest fully, then left it without effort, as natural as the tide pulling back from shore. The weight of the day pressed gently on his shoulders and spine, not as a burden, but as a reminder of hours lived and work done. Muscles that had carried him through long stretches of road and time now softened, releasing their tension one fiber at a time. The fire shifted again, a log settling into a more comfortable position, sending a brief cascade of sparks upward before they vanished into the dark of the stove. The sound was muted, contained, almost polite. He watched the glow brighten and fade, his eyes tracing the slow movement of light across the iron surface, the subtle changes in color that marked the fire's steady consumption of fuel. There was something deeply calming in that process, in watching something burn not violently, but patiently, doing exactly what it was meant to do. Thoughts came and went, but none stayed long. They drifted through like clouds, recognizable but not demanding. Memories surfaced without detail, more impressions than stories. A sense of long roads. Early mornings. Evenings like this one, repeated in different places, all sharing the same quiet rhythm. There was no need to sort through them or assign meaning. They existed, and that was enough. He reached for the mug resting on the small table beside him. The ceramic was warm, not hot, its surface slightly rough where the glaze had thinned with age. He took a slow sip, the liquid soothing as it traveled down, spreading warmth through his chest and stomach. The taste was simple and familiar, not sharp, not sweet, just grounding. He held the mug for a moment longer, enjoying the feel of it in his hands, the gentle heat seeping into his palms and fingers. The cabin made its own quiet sounds as the night deepened. A faint pop from a cooling beam. A low groan as the structure settled further into stillness. None of it was alarming. It was the sound of a place alive in its own way, adjusting, responding to the slow changes in temperature and light. He listened without tension, his body recognizing the difference between danger and simple movement. As time passed, the fire dimmed further, the glow shrinking, the warmth becoming more subtle. He stood once more, not quickly, but with care, joints moving through their familiar range, each motion deliberate and unhurried. Adding another piece of wood to the stove, he closed the door gently, watching as the new log caught, the coals brightening just enough to welcome it. The act felt ceremonial, a small ritual marking the continuation of the night. When he sat back down, the chair accepted him with a soft creak, the wood shaped perfectly to his weight. He leaned back, shoulders resting fully, spine supported, head easing into a position that required no effort to maintain. His eyes grew heavy, lids lowering not because he willed them to, but because there was no reason to keep them open. The firelight flickered across the room one last time before his vision blurred and softened. Sleep approached slowly, respectfully. It did not rush or pull. It simply waited, allowing his body to settle completely, allowing the last bits of tension to dissolve. The sounds of the night blended together into a single, low presence, no longer distinguishable as wind or leaves or distant drops of water. Just a steady, encompassing hush. His breathing deepened further, the pauses between breaths growing longer, more relaxed. The muscles in his face smoothed, jaw unclenching, brow easing. The weight of his hands rested comfortably on the arms of the chair, fingers curled slightly, relaxed. The mug sat forgotten on the table, its warmth fading, steam long since gone. Dreams, if they came, were gentle and indistinct. There were no sharp images, no sudden movements. Only sensations. The feeling of warmth against the skin. The sense of being still while the world continued quietly around him. A deep, abiding safety, rooted not in walls or locks, but in familiarity and acceptance. The fire burned low again, the glow now faint but steady, enough to keep the chill at bay. The cabin held the heat well, the thick walls slowing the night's advance. Outside, the forest remained calm, the wind easing even further, leaves barely stirring. The world seemed to be holding its breath, content to remain as it was. Hours passed unnoticed. The boundary between night and early morning blurred. At some point, the sky began to lighten imperceptibly, not enough to change the darkness inside the cabin, but enough to signal a shift. The temperature dipped slightly, the kind of cold that sharpened the air but did not bite. Inside, the warmth lingered, the fire's last effort still present. He stirred only once, a small shift in the chair, a deeper breath drawn in, then released. Sleep held him gently, refusing to let go too quickly. When he finally woke, it was not with a start, but with a gradual return of awareness. The weight of his body. The solid presence of the chair. The faint smell of ash and wood smoke. His eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the dim light. The fire had gone out completely, leaving only a darkened stove and a faint trace of warmth in the air. The cabin was quiet, almost reverent. He sat for a moment without moving, simply being awake, letting the last remnants of sleep fade naturally. Outside, the forest was wrapped in early morning stillness. The wind had gone, and with it, most of the sound. The world felt paused, balanced between night and day. He stood and stretched gently, muscles responding with mild stiffness that eased as he moved. There was no rush to do anything else. When he opened the door, cool air flowed in, fresh and clean, carrying the scent of damp earth and leaves. A thin mist hung low among the trees, softening their shapes, making the forest feel smaller and more intimate. He stepped out onto the porch, the wood cool under his boots, and breathed deeply. The sky was pale, almost colorless, the sun still hidden behind clouds and distant hills. Birds had not yet begun their calls. Everything waited. He rested his hands on the railing, feeling the grain of the wood beneath his fingers, the slight roughness where years of weather had left their mark. There was a quiet satisfaction in that moment. Not pride. Not accomplishment. Just the simple knowledge that he had endured another night, that he had rested, that he was present. The cabin behind him stood firm and silent, ready to offer shelter again when needed. The forest ahead remained unchanged, patient and vast. He stayed there for a long time, unmoving, letting the morning come to him at its own pace. When the first faint sounds of waking life finally reached him, distant and soft, he did not resist them. He took one last deep breath, filling his lungs with the cool air, and let it out slowly. The night had done its work.